Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our lecture series, Experiments in Thinking, Action, and Form. And this is our final lecture in the series this spring. And I'm very happy to welcome Michael Eng, who is a philosopher and visiting us from John Carroll University. And he's someone who I actually known for some time, first in Vienna and in a number of other situations. But in this modest bio, which I'm going to read, I'll describe some of the things that he's been engaged in doing. And he's currently teaching at John Carroll University. His courses are in aesthetics and philosophy and film, and he had taught previously at Pratt Institute for almost a decade in the program of critical and visual studies, and also in its international summer seminar in architecture and urban design. His areas of research include sound, philosophy of the image, philosophy and architecture, and post-Heideggerian aesthetic theory. He has published previously on Jean-Luc Godard's TV video work in relationship to Deleuze's cinema, and on the film video installation works of various artists, including Knut Asdam, Mariam Jaffrey, and we had a dialogue also now a really long time ago in Vienna around an exhibition that I had at the Secession there in 1999. He's currently writing on Jean-Luc Nancy and Jacques Ranciere's respective theorizations of the image, and is also at work on two manuscripts, The Scene of the Voice, Language and Aesthesis of Finitude, and The Sense of the Image, the Metaphysical Imaginary in Cinema, Architecture, and Philosophy. And he has a publication that's coming out in May in Deleuze Studies. And so, without belaboring this introduction, I'm going to invite Michael to join us here. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Renee, for that really warm introduction. Yeah, I guess we've known each other for a long time. And I'm very grateful for that. I'm going to stand if that's okay. I have a few slides, but I think my voice projects a little bit better when I'm standing up. I think that my talk will be about a half an hour or so. So that will be plenty of time for discussion, hopefully. And I welcome your comments. This is kind of work in progress. I'm interested in, I guess I would say, kind of meta questions. I'm interested in why certain trends actually develop, what the kind of desire is behind trends within critical art practice as well as contemporary critical theory. So I'll just begin. Sound and Semiocapitalism, Affective Labor and the Metaphysics of the Real. The aim of my presentation this evening is twofold. I want to first thank the sonic and affective turns that have been taking place these last few years in both critical thought and contemporary art practice, as expressions of the same general tendency. After explaining these turns and the critical desire animating them, I would like to articulate a concern, one might even say a worry, that the current preoccupation with sound and affect is, on the one hand, a symptom of a particular metaphysical fantasy, which I would characterize as a desire for the real. On the other hand, the current preoccupation may also be a further kind of training in that vast metaphysical system known as late capitalism, which Franco Bifo Berardi has named Semiocapitalism. In what follows, I will first identify what I believe constitute the sonic and affective turns along the current critical and aesthetic horizons. Then I will discuss the work of Jacques Rancière in relationship to Harun Mirza's sound installation Sick from 2011 as an instance of these turns. I will then evaluate Rancière and Mirza from the perspective of Bifo's critique of semiocapitalism. My talk is divided into three parts after this initial introduction. While one may point to the late 1960s as the moment of sound art's emergence with the work of such artists as Max Neuhaus, Lamonte Young, Alvin Lucier, and John Cage, the last decade has seen a decided increase in interest in sound in contemporary art practice. Since the year 2000, there have been numerous and regular offerings of exhibitions dedicated to sound, such as Sound as Media, Tokyo 2000, Bring the Noise, Geneva 2000, Sonic Process, Barcelona, London, Paris 2002, Sonic Boom at the Hayward Gallery 2003, Phonorama, ZKM 2004, and in the 2011 Venice Biennale, about which I will speak more in a few moments, sound played a central role in many of the works featured. The Taiwan Pavilion, for instance, was dedicated exclusively to sound works. Sound occupied a central place in works from Christian Boltanski, Harun Mirza, Nathaniel Mellors, and Jennifer Alora and Guillermo Calzadilla. Parallel to this increased prominence of sound in exhibition practices have been a number of symposia dedicated to theorizing sound art. In 2008, the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna held a symposium titled Non-Simultaneity and Immediacy, the Utopia of Sound. And just this past November, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago produced a Sound Art Theory Symposium, which I took part in. I was fortunate enough to. There were many of the movers and shakers of sound art theorization, and there was me. I got in by accident. Anyway, so it's kind of interesting to see this development. This pronounced interest in sound in contemporary art practice testifies to what Caleb Kelly has described as a determination by artists not only to treat sound as material, but to present sound as an integral component of artistic production. Concurrent with contemporary art practices' engagement with sound has been the critical study of sonic culture, a notion that covers such phenomena as noise and its relationship to the expanding processes of globalization and urbanization, as well as the use of sound as a weapon of war, such as the employment of sonic booms as sound bombs in the Gaza Strip by the Israeli Air Force. Poet-theorist Fred Moten has attempted to uncover sound's role in the constitution of race and gender. Together, these various engagements constitute the sonic turn, as Jim Drobnik has coined the phrase, in an echo of W.J.T. Mitchell's notion of the pictorial turn. The sonic turn resonates and coincides with what has been named the affective turn that has taken place primarily in the social sciences and the humanities the last few years. In his foreword to a volume on the affective turn, Michael Hart identifies feminist theory's focus on the body and queer theory's exploration of the emotions as guiding sites for the turn to affect. Work by feminist thinkers such as Kathy Weeks, furthermore, has been interested in the advent of affective labor as a sign of the racial and gender division of reproductive labor, where jobs requiring the management and production of certain types of emotions, such as healthcare, service, and sex work, falls disproportionately to women, especially women of color. In addition, Italian post-Marxist theorists like Antonio Negri, Maurizio Lazzarato, and Berardi have been concerned with post-Fordist means of production that discipline cognitive and emotional labor as the primary sites of capital's global expansion. One characteristic the sonic and affective turns share is an antagonism with the other turns in critical thought that have preceded them, most immediately the linguistic turn. Here, the sonic turn in the arts can be seen in many respects as a response and oftentimes remedy to the hegemony of the critique of discursivity and logocentrism in conceptual art. In the social sciences and the humanities, the affective turn is often seen as a recovery of the body after Derrida's famous phrase, "There is no outside the text," which is typically understood to mean that there is nothing outside language. Understood incorrectly, but that's how it's understood. Dissatisfied with the linguistic turn's foreclosing of our access to the real, a real that is by definition unmediated by representation, I see the sonic and affective turns as expressions for the really real. Inasmuch as the sonic and affective turns eschew a reification of language, I worry that they reinscribe a metaphysics of the real. Another instance of the affective turn in contemporary thought I would submit is the recent work of Jacques Rancière and his conception of the politics of aesthetics as a distribution of the sensible. Rancière also happens to have been taken up with some enthusiasm within contemporary art practice and theory, and so he provides an opportunity to examine what can be liberating about the turn to affect, as well as what I want to argue we still must be cautious of in our eagerness to be free of representation. Does the turn to affect simply prepare us for work as affective laborers in late capitalism? This will raise questions that concern not only the reinscription of conservative forces in cultural practice, but especially the role academic and art institutions play in the reproduction of the capitalist mode of production. To bring my analysis of the affective and sonic turns together, I will now consider Mirza's sick from the standpoint of Rancière's reflections on the distribution of the sensible. I will seek to outline the contours of what can only be called a dialectical formation. Rancière's work may help us avoid an investment in the medium specificity of sound, and therefore the idea that sound somehow provides more direct access to the real than other art forms and practices. However, the liberation from the essentialism of medium specificity Rancière provides may set us up for further training in affective labor in the ways intimated just above. So this is the beginning of my second section. And I'll take a dramatic pause now. What's going to happen? Okay. Section 2, sick, and the distribution of the sensible. Sick is a sound sculpture installation that was exhibited at the 2011 Venice Biennale, which no doubt many here in the audience have also seen. Sick is very much an installation to the extent that it cannot be analyzed adequately in separation from the space in which it was installed. While this may be an accurate enough statement regarding any installation, it was all the more true with Sick as it appeared within the Parapavilion designed by Monika Sosnowska that was in the Central International Pavilion curated by Biennale director Bice Kuriga. Sosnowska's Parapavilion, titled Antechamber, was one of 4 commissioned by the Biennale, described in the Biennale's exhibition catalog as largest structures of a sculptural, architectural nature, capable of harboring works by other artists. These parapavilions, the catalog proceeds to say, were intended to act as meta-objects, whose purpose was to serve as countersites to the National Pavilion infrastructure that is traditional to the Biennale. As countersites, the parapavilions were subsequently directed at fostering an exchange between the artworks they exhibited that was to be more intense, I'm quoting, than the interactions one might have found between artworks exhibited in the national pavilions. From these more intense exchanges, the catalog text proposes that, quote, new forms of community are negotiated and that attention is given to the fact that there are other voices besides that of the curator. Sosnowska's antechamber was an irregular star-shaped structure that plays with the distinction between inside and outside, interiority and exteriority, in order to try to convey the reception of the work phenomenologically. I will now shift to the present tense in my description. As one enters into the room housing the parapavilion from the central pavilion's other spaces, one is technically outside the star structure and sees first its unfinished dry walls and steel studs. Stepping into the star's center, One encounters its Venetian wallpapered interior and a somewhat dizzying optical effect where the wallpapered surfaces meet to form the star's points. Save for the wallpaper, there is no work displayed inside the parapavilion. One finds that one needs to step outside into one of the structure's other exterior spaces, which incidentally also happens to be at the same time the interior of the white cube the parapavilion disrupts, to view the work antechamber exhibits, or in another sense, frames. Two of these exterior-interior spaces present two of David Goldblatt's photo series of post-apartheid Johannesburg, his aerial perspective housing series, and a series titled Ex-Offenders at the Scene of the Crime from 2010, composed of portraits of formerly incarcerated people back at the places where they committed their crimes, many of them violent acts. Text narrating their crimes accompanies each portrait. As one circulates through the parapavilion, Mirza Sikh appears even before one even reaches the actual section housing it. Due to the rather harsh, pulsating electronic beat emanating from it, before one even learns the work's title, it would not be inaccurate to say that a feeling of sickness washes over the parapavilion's visitor. At least that was the case for this visitor. For the sound has the effect of compressing the already compressed spaces of the parapavilion further still. Upon entering the space, one is greeted on the left-hand side by a speaker situated on a small shelf about a fifth of the way up the wall. There is a glass tube fixed atop the speaker and a gold nugget bouncing up and down in accordance with the work's pulsating beat. On the floor to the lower right, across from the speaker, featuring the gold nugget, lays a black triangular foam board assemblage with three mirrored surfaces, which could be disassembled laptop screens along two of its sides. One screen stands up vertically, seemingly held in place by two pieces of foil or a plastic garbage bag and Scotch tape. A projection of what appears to be an overexposed photograph of a crowd flashes beneath the assemblage onto one of the horizontally arranged screens or mirrors. The flashing follows the beat of the pulsating sound. The third screen by the corner, supported at the parapavilion's wall, features a parallel track of blue-purplish LEDs running from the bottom of the screen towards its top. The assemblage's third side is propped up against one of the parapavilion's wall, and at the far corner of the assemblage, touching the wall, rests another speaker. Diagonally from the foam board assemblage is a pink-reddish LED anchored at 3 points in the form of an upside-down triangle. Opposite the LED ribbon is a third speaker placed on the floor. Along the two sides of the work, black speaker wires, as well as blue and red wires that did not seem to offer an electronic connection, link each side's components to each other. However, there are no wires linking the installation's left and right sides together. Visually, the work does not permit itself to be easily photographed or documented as a whole, so one needs to move among its components, an aspect at a time, to give a sense of what it does. Nor can one easily, I believe, reconstruct the logic that connects Goldblatt's photographs with Mirza's work and the parapavilion itself. though because of sonic intrusion or leakage, it is neither all that simple to think of these pieces as disconnected. As one might expect, Goldblatt has not been very enthusiastic about how his work is exhibited in the Parapavilion, feeling that the work was treated as an afterthought. And in his review of this year's Biennale for the New York Times, last year's Biennale for the New York Times, Roderick Conway Morris observes that, quote, "It is difficult to appreciate fully these absorbing images by Goldblatt because of the head-bangingly loud electronic noises emitted by the London-born Harun Mirza's installation, insensitively placed next to them," unquote. However, rather than say that Goldblatt's and Morris's reactions serve as a sign of some kind of failure by Sanoska's Parapavilion to negotiate new forms of community as the catalog text projects it as its ambition, I want to consider their dissatisfaction in terms Rancière specifically assigns to community, which is to say that I want to consider their dissatisfaction as forms of dissensus. Every community that is based on the concept of consensus, such as democracy, according to Rancière, rests on a series of contradictions, or what he calls scandals. On the one hand, there is first the identification of communal parts among which the community share is equally distributed. This first share is the sense of community itself, the aesthetic identification of who is to be recognized as a member of the community. For Rancière, the distribution of this first share is a fundamental principle of equality, in which all members exist on the same level as long as they are able to be recognized as community members. One of the originary instances of this first share, according to Rancière, is to be found in Aristotle's Politics, specifically in his definition of the human as the animal possessing language, logos, as opposed to non-human animals which simply have a voice, phone. On the other hand, however, there is the question of the measure by which one determines the initial share, which can only be arbitrary, which is to say groundless. For Rancière, this foundational scandal, the irrationality of the rational distribution of communal sense, becomes exposed in a secondary scandal, namely Aristotle's recognition of the slave as a human being who understands language, for how else could the slave obey commands, but paradoxically does not have it. This contradiction exposes Aristotle's act of defining the human as symbolic and hence arbitrary rather than material and natural. Rancière's greater point is that any identification of communal parts entails, quote, a false count, a double count, or a miscount, unquote, which results in a determination of a class of those whose part is to have no part, an observation borne out by history to the extent that there has always been a class, such as, this is Rancière again, the poor of ancient times, the third estate, the modern proletariat, for whom their part of the communal share is either all or nothing. Possessing a shared capacity for language has never gotten in the way of establishing and putting in place groups whose sole function is to serve as the outside of a community within it. It is this originary wrong to which politics, Rancière says, is directed at revising through a redistribution of the sensible. Those powers that resist such revision and that are opposed to politics, Rancière gives the name the police, that order which keeps in place the existing division of bodies and communal shares, and maintains the existing possibilities of the sayable and the visible. It is the police that requires consensus, which is why Rancière counts political philosophy among the police order of things. Politics, which Rancière proclaims happens very little or rarely, is in essence dissensual. All politics is aesthetics in Rancière's conception, but what does this mean for art, which explicitly makes the aesthetic its object? Does this mean that art necessarily realizes politics from the sheer fact that it is art? The short answer to this question, as far as Rancière is concerned, is no. The full answer requires a longer excursus into the schema of artistic regimes Rancière offers in place of the art historical teleology that includes modernism and its discontents. Nonetheless, we should note that just as political philosophy serves a police function in the theorization of the socius by suppressing the scandal at the heart of the community, Traditional aesthetic theory serves the same function insofar as it blocks access to and suppresses the scandal that is artistic mimesis. This is especially true in Rancière's view of the discourse of modernism, which orders the arts according to her medium specificity, that is, autonomy, and conceives art history as unidirectional. The discourse of modernity thus perpetuates the repression of mimesis that Rancière identifies as first taking place in Plato, who understood the threat of artistic mimesis as arising from its ability to provide images of bodies speaking more than one voice and occupying more than one place. To undo, that is to say, the divisions between the sayable and the visible. How can Rancière help us see what is at stake in the assemblage of Mirza's Sick, Goldblatt's series, and Sanowska's Parapavilion? Rancière, we can be pretty certain, would not go as far as the text of the Biennale catalog in arguing that the Dissensus, inspired by such an assemblage, negotiates a new form of community. We are, after all, talking about the global art exhibition of global art exhibitions, a police form of the institution of art, if there ever was one. But perhaps this is precisely the point. Politics, if it is to occur anywhere, must occur within and against the police order of things. I believe then that one can assert from a Rancièrean point of view or standpoint that the curatorial event of the Parapavilion stages, as Rancière would say, a heteronomy of sense. It makes visible the reality of the aesthetic, which, as Jean-Luc Nancy would say, is always singular plural, whether intentional or not. If Mirza's Sick contributes to a redistribution of the sensible, it is not because any power that is essential to sound, which in accordance with such a supposed power would dictate that sound simply do what it's told. Sick is not more real and hence more political because it employs sound and is supposedly free of signification or representation. Yet sound in this particular assemblage serves a principal role as a thread in the delinking of meaning and image, of the movement through space with the progress of the understanding. Sick helps at once to make sensible the fact that there is sense, and the fact that sense is something both shared and divided, partagé. That phrase, the distribution of the sensible, in the French is partage du sensible, and the notion of partage means to share, divide, distribute, and it also has a kind of theological sense to it. Perhaps this sounds romantic. Rancière would actually agree. However, the romantic here does not carry the pejorative sense that we so-called postmoderns typically give it. What Rancière calls the aesthetic regime of the arts, which encompasses Lessing's romantic discovery of the Lacan, and is the more accurate name for what Rancière calls that, quote, incoherent label, modernity, is characterized by the perpetual mixing of art and non-art. Is that moment in the history of artistic practice where the threat of artistic mimesis is recovered in the form of the Kantian thing in itself, the Schopenhauerian will, and the Nietzschean chiasmus of Apollo and Dionysus. Rancière, one might say, despite himself, becomes closely aligned with Nancy's and Philippe Le Coulebart's rethinking of mimesis as Darstellung, presentation as opposed to its traditional translation as imitation or representation, Vorstellung. Thus, the incommensurability of the arts theorized in Lessing's reflections on the Lacan testifies for Rancière to the measurelessness of the communal sharing of sense, which casts all community as contingent. What the discourse of modernism calls the autonomy of the arts is actually, according to Rancière, the reality of the mélange, the lack of a final measure of sense. The undoing of a fixed sense of sense, then, is the exposure of community as unfinished, as unworked, as what Nancy once called désœuvré. Ultimately, is the refusal of bodies and voices to stay in place, the possibility that the existing conditions of sensibility, the existing place of bodies, the existing division between the sayable, the visible, and perhaps we should also add the audible, could be thought otherwise. Except that the refusal to stay in place is also exactly that mode into which semiocapitalism, as Berardi calls it, places us as subjects. Is Rancière's dissensus, then, something capital has already appropriated and therefore subsumed to the police order of existence? Is sound's ability to leak through fixed spatial divisions a metaphor for capital? So this is my third and final section, sound and semiocapitalism. By now, I would expect many here to recognize that the critique I am attempting to provoke follows closely the spirit of the one undertaken by Benjamin Buchloh in his well-known essay from 1990 that historicizes conceptual art. In that piece, or attempts to provide a historicization of conceptual art. In that piece, Buchloh linked conceptual art's miming of the aesthetics of administration to the rise of late capitalism, therefore placing into question whether conceptual art was really able to make visible Adorno's prediction of a totally administered world, or whether it simply helped prepare the way for such totalization by capital. Buchloh's critique aligns very closely with the one Frederick Jameson offers approximately 20 years earlier in The Prison House of Language. However, both are preceded by Walter Benjamin, who in En ce motifs in Baudelaire in 1939 wondered about the ways the cinema trained human perception in the shocks and movement of industrial production. The fact that economic and cultural production today, at least in the global north, is ruled by the logic of information is recognizable enough. However, Berardi describes this hegemonic moment with the term semiocapitalism, which includes the manipulation and movement of information, but also the production of immaterial objects that are both information and vehicles of affects, images, moods, ideas, concepts. This is to say, the products of aesthetic and intellectual labor, which is accomplished through the consumption of such objects as well. According to Berardi, under semiocapitalism, labor is transformed under a dual process of precarization and deterritorialization. The former is an effect of the latter. Semiotic commodities do not require a specific physical place for their production. The cognitive laborer can work anywhere. Moreover, the production of immaterial objects can be, and often is, crowdsourced, which means the value produced by what Marx called the general intellect, the abstract knowledge objectified in the means of production, is virtually limitless, because there can always be someone working. Production in semiocapitalism takes place over an endless day. The deterritorialization of labor results in precarization, because now labor time no longer correlates in any standard or reliably calculatable way to production. If one is always working, then the time during which one works is intermeshed, often messily so, with activity that does not directly go to the production of the object. Furthermore, since everyone is now always working together but separately, social organization is fragmented to a greater degree than ever before. Working all the time means labor never coheres into a continuity of experience. Working anywhere and nowhere specifically means being blocked from forming social cohesion. This is how semiocapitalism has appropriated the affective labor of the artist and the intellectual, who, it was once quaintly thought, pursues his or her work out of a passion or inspiration that did not obey the set hours of traditional capitalist production. Precarization underscores a further contradiction in semiocapitalism, which is that of the destruction of sensibility, of the power to be affected. Semiocapitalism demands cognition without sensibility, the ability to manipulate information without critically encountering and interpreting it. But this is also because there is no longer time to be affected when one is always working, producing affects. This is a contradiction because it means semiocapitalism requires the production of affects disconnected from sensibility. So in closing, I would like to offer two observations, perhaps two provocations, if you will. First observation, provocation. What if encountering sound as part of the materiality of the work, despite its liberating potential to dislodge us from the specular, from the formal, and from medium specificity. We're also a mode in which we submit ourselves to the task of incorporating one more vector of information, of training ourselves to assimilate it and redirect it when called upon. What if our consumption of sound were a way to further put ourselves at the services of the general intellect? Second observation, provocation. Replace Rancière's notion of dissensus and the contingency of community with Berardi's concept of precarization. If there is no difference between the unworking of community and precarization, then how can we say that dissensus is really opposed to the police order of existence? How can we say that politics, which is to say change, ever occurs in the aesthetic, when the aesthetic is now the order of the day? Thank you. Oh, sorry.
If anyone has any questions, just raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic.
The way you were using affect and the way you're using the sensible, are they interchangeable? How would you, in your theorization of affect and your theorization of the sensible, sort of tease those two terms apart?
Yeah, thank you. I see Rancière's notion of sensibility as a subset of affect. So your question touches on a kind of subtext, not subtext, or like a or text of the presentation, which is the notion of affect as it comes from Spinoza. So for Spinoza, affect is something that is both rational and of the mind and of the body at the same time, which is why it's a source of interest, especially for feminist theory and queer theory. So sensibility in the way that I understand Rancière to think about it belongs to this larger notion of affect. It itself is not necessarily this joining of the rational and the visceral. It itself is a condition for intelligibility. That's what sensibility is for Rancière, right? So what can be seen and what can be heard, determination of that determines what can be understood. Yeah. Another way to put it is what we see is not just simply, you know, in the kind of older phenomenological sense, like just objects speaking to us, right? What we see has already gone through a series of selection. What we see is what we are allowed to see, what we're allowed to experience. So that's the police order that I was talking about.
Thanks. I have two questions. The first is about the notion of semiocapitalism and the idea that semiocapitalism produces conditions of labor which don't allow for social cohesion. I guess I'm just wondering, because like in Marx, like non-semio, just capitalism proper, there still is no social cohesion, right? Like the working day in that instance is still a situation of alienation and surplus labor pitted against the worker or whatever.
Yes.
So I guess in one sense, I'd love if you could characterize like what affective distinction there is between the capital scenario and the semio-capital scenario, if there is any. Or, and then the other question I have is, so I apologize, I missed the first part of your talk, and you may have stated this very clearly, but I'm very interested in the way that you've invoked Rancière here, because as you're probably aware, at least in the art and curatorial context, many folks invoke Rancière and Mouffe and these notions of dissensus in this like discursive way, right? That dissensus is important because of a participatory, intersubjective, dialogical opportunity. And I love the metaphor of sound that you're using, But I guess I'm just wondering, like, really in terms of hard aesthetics, like, what would be, or how can sound produce that kind of participatory intersubjective encounter, or is that just not exactly the point in your theorization? I guess is my two questions.
Thank you. Well, I answered both of those questions in the first part of my paper, which you missed. No, I'm joking. They're very good questions. This is going to sound a little bit just simple, but I think that what Berardi is doing, at least in his thinking of semiocapitalism, is and that idea of fragmentation is simply an intensification of the fragmentation that occurs already in capital, in the sense of linear accumulation and so on. So with semiocapitalism, the difference is there's nonlinear accumulation, and I would say that I guess Berardi is a little bit closer to the Frankfurt School in the sense that not only are we fragmented, but we have what we work through are these simulacra of cohesion, right? Such as social media and so on. So they're really simulacra, right? And it's more of a kind of intensification of mystification as well. In that sense, so that I can expand on that if you'd like, but I think that's the most direct way to talk about it. There's not a difference in kind; it's simply a difference in degree. Berardi goes further to talk about how the precarization and deterritorialization of labor, though, in semiocapitalism, that kind of fragmentation leads to these crises in the economic order that will never be really resolved again. So that's an essential difference in the working of capital. Crisis it's a perpetual crisis rather than a cycling of crisis and then stabilization. In terms of Rancière, I'm not sure I am too much in agreement, or I see exactly the dialogic, intersubjective aspect. I think that for Rancière, what one of the valuable things that he's doing with his notion of sensibility, or the distribution of the sensible, is to call our attention to the process of subjectivization. So this would precede some notion of the dialogic, where you have two already formed subjects that that just kind of interact, right? That's the fantasy of community, that we're all these individual subjects already, that we just come together, right? That's the modernist notion of community. Maybe even politics. You can see a little bit this in Arendt, for example, although that could be debatable. So sound, the way that I was going towards sound was as this way to kind of like make felt, right? Especially in Mirza's piece, this way to make felt the contingency of community, right? It's when we are invested in community as a already fixed object that can just be recovered or lost that we fall into a kind of intellectual or metaphysical error. For this is especially true for Nancy, who's reading community through Bataille, and wants to keep open this idea of contingency, of being cracked. That's the experience of finitude for Nancy and Bataille. Rancière he's kind of impatient with that kind of Heideggerian ease or whatever. So I guess I'm not sure I'm exactly answering your question directly. I know I'm not doing it on its terms. I guess I have some misgivings about the dialogic conception of the distribution, that notion of partage.
I have two questions or comments, and I come from the perspective as a cultural sociologist, so not necessarily as someone who studies aesthetics. The only way I can describe my two questions or concerns is that I think, from the perspective of a cultural sociologist, it seems that your subject matter and then the idea of semiocapitalism are both truncated or constrained to elite culture. So I think that distorts the nature of the consequences and the understanding, as far as I can tell. Just let me be brief. So you're concerned about the idea of the sonic and affective turn in culture, but you're only looking at elite culture, a handful of art museums or whatever. So I don't understand why you're concerned about the consequences, given there's so much culture that is consumed and produced by people that has a real impact on global production and capital. So, I'm taking more of the perspective of sort of Bourdieu here, where the culture you're looking at is really used to justify itself, to separate elites from other elites, rather than something that is really integral to capitalist production in a global sense. And then the second issue has to do with semiocapitalism, which I think the idea of semiocapitalism is again true for elites. I mean, there are 1 or 5% of elites in advanced capitalist democracies who are transnational, who jet set, who fly, and who deal with symbols, doctors, radiologists, lawyers, professors. But out of 6 or 7 billion people, most people, labor is not mobile. Capital is mobile. You have finance moving all over. And in fact, studies show that international migration is actually lower today than it was 70 years ago, because you have restrictions on where people can move, especially poor people. The bottom 4 billion, 5 billion, they can't move. Only the elite can. So this idea of semiocapitalism seems to be a reflection of this sort of elite ideology rather than reality.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I agree. I would just say that that's the point. So when I mentioned global north, that's what I was talking about. And I think in terms of let me just say in response to the first question or first part of your concern. Again, I think that I agree that this notion of semiocapitalism is a way to keep in place or actually intensify the racial and gender division of labor globally. Right? So the semiocapitalism belongs to the division, now the kind of current division between the global north and global south. And that's precisely the point, that capital moves and that labor doesn't move. But that, and I teach in a university, and that's a factory just like anything else. It's just making widgets. There's no, we're producing affects. I don't know. I don't know how it is at MIT. But maybe I'll find out one day. If I'm lucky, that would be to be lucky in our world. But more and more I see that my job as a professor is to make sure that people's feelings aren't hurt, rather than tell them the truth. And especially when you're untenured, you have to care about people's feelings in that way, right? And I think that's a very real restriction. And I don't want to say like that's the epitome of labor. What what I'm doing, or that's the lowest kind of form. Although some days it feels that way. But I think that the, you know, even in terms of the least elite kinds of institutions, the discourse is one of producing knowledge workers, producing workers who are able to negotiate a more globalized world. This is the rhetoric. I'm sure you've heard of it, right? From community colleges to there, it's there in high schools. That is the order. So and I think the point of the fact that you can do work anywhere has to do with the technocratic. It doesn't mean you can go anywhere. That's the distinction. It doesn't mean you get to go anywhere. It means that wherever you are, like you're always at the office. And that's Berardi talks about multitasking that way. And I think it's important to see how this works in your phrase elite culture. I would call it the global north, because that is what determines and keeps in place the divisions between the global north and the global south, or that's a factor in that. There are other cultures that go to produce what is consumed within global capitalism. But again, I definitely agree with that, and they're not supposed to be seen or heard from, or they're not supposed to move, right? Again, I'm not sure I quite answer your question, but that's my quick reaction. In terms of, I think I answered both. At least I believe I tried. And if you're dissatisfied, I can appreciate that, and we can hash it out a little bit later. Thank you.
So in your closing comments, you mentioned the word immaterial and sounded immaterial as if I heard it correctly, as a kind of provocation you wanted to lead out your talk. I'm curious to hear more from your perspective, like what you think of this kind of like word connection, like sound and immaterial, and how you see it, and also like what do you think is this this embracing that has been happening in the last like 10-15 years, a lot about this like idea of seeing sound as something immaterial, and then with a question mark, I would like to see this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Florian. So what I think about people talking about it, sound as immaterial, is that the provocation was to try to say that the conception of sound as immaterial is a mystification. It masks the actual materiality that is at work. So, and not only or not exclusively the materiality or the material grounds that are necessary for the production of sound, and for the reception of sound, for the framing of sound, and so on, but also the kind of materiality that is at stake in the very conception of sound as immaterial. Like, how does that mask certain kinds of exclusions that are at work, of who can hear. In the case of sound art, who's allowed to hear it? Who's allowed to consume it, right? And it gets back to that other question. I am interested in the production of or reproduction of specific kinds of subjects in that sense. So that would be my answer.
Did you come across a certain a point in time, like for example, like if we like think of Lyotard's curated exhibition at the Centre de Pompidou in 1985 that was named Les Immatériaux, that this eventually like triggered the thinking about the immaterial in these past 25 years more. Is this something you came across? Or?
Yeah, that's the one that Leo Tao wrote on as well. Is that right? Yeah. I didn't come across that recently, but your question really is helpful to think about that. But yeah, I mean, it belongs to that whole idea of the immateriality of the artwork, right? The kind of becoming immaterial of the artwork. Rancière does write on this as well, and I think that I don't have much more to add other than what Buchloh has done in the sense like that works hand in hand with how late capitalism works. Yeah. So I don't mean to just say like things are impossible, although that's my predilection is to kind of arrive there and say, well, this all sucks, but or you're just going to end up reinscribing stuff. But I think that I'm interested in kind of disrupting the confidence in declaring sound as more real or affect as more real, sound as immaterial, therefore more real, right? And that's straight from Schopenhauer. You know, that sound, music is the purest expression of the will with a capital W, right? So, you know, and I'm interested in the kind of willful forgetting of these kinds of repetitions.
I wonder if you can, something I wasn't clear on in your talk is like when you say the word sound and you're talking about sound art, sort of how you are, like are you including sort of all possible forms of sound organization and time in all contexts? Or is there kind of something more specific that you're looking at? And I guess a particular sort of facet of that would be the recent discourse around Seth Kim Cohen's book relating to kind of the value of like sort of sound almost as a flat, atemporal representational media, which I think is sort of more of how you see it in recent sort of visual art practices where sound becomes like a niche media that's integrated to kind of reify some kind of aspect of someone's existing work versus, you know, lineages of sound art that really are still very much connected to ideas about time and form and structure and a kind of meaning that really resists ideas about representation in the same way. So I don't know, I'm just curious about sort of how you're, when you say sound and sound art, what actually do you mean?
Yeah, thank you. I don't think you're going to like this answer, but I'm talking about the discourse on sound rather than specific works, and I certainly appreciate the very rich and capacious kind of history of sound art and everything that falls under that kind of vague category, and that's part of the discourse. That, you know, it's this kind of rehearsing of like what is sound, like, you know, a lot of these symposia are dedicated to what is sound art. That's the question that keeps getting posed, right? That becomes the vehicle of the discourse on sound art. So that's what I'm trying to kind of disrupt again. Like, if that becomes a question, like what is sound art? They're always kind of like you can see this like in architectural theory. What is the relationship between theory and practice? Every single symposium. What is the relation between theory and practice, right? Because we don't know, so we have to figure it out. What is sound art? We don't know. We got to figure it out before we theorize it, right? I think, well, fine. If you want to ask those questions, then fine. But I think that kind of like positivist drive is not really too interesting. I think what your question points to is that there's a proliferation, that there is a multiplicity, and that's what I was trying to talk about with this kind of reality of the aesthetic that Rancière does point out, that there is not going to be one moment, right, where Christ comes again and everything falls under the label and everything's secure. It's the proliferation of the aesthetic, and I think that's more of what's at stake than cataloging what counts as sound art or not sound art. So that's why I can't really answer your question based upon that. I'm interested again more in what motivates the desire to kind of like decide, which Ronseer would call the police order, right? That kind of police desire. Thank you.
Any other questions?
No, thank you, Michael. That was very interesting talk, very thought provocative, and I'm very interested in what you've referred to as the global north in relation to the question that arose around the elite aesthetic form. And I think that I'm interested in that, in addition to also being interested in this notion of the reality of the aesthetic. And it brings to mind something else that I've been probing through the readings of Fred Moten, as well as Hortense Spillers. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about what you're thinking about, because this aspect that has to do with trying to find some form of reality in relationship to particular aesthetic form, in particular sound or music,
Right.
is something that I'm very curious about, and the way that it's been used in discourse in a number of different kinds of ways is something I'd be curious to know further your thoughts on.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Renee. That's a really good question, and I think that's something that is definitely in the background, or at least haunts this paper in a certain way, or this whatever this is yet. And that is the identification of the natural with the raced body, and sound as raced as well. That's, for example, Paul Uka wrote a book on the naturalization of race and the racialization of nature. So there's this kind of, within early American the kind of founding of the U.S., right? There's this kind of drive to identify nature as race so that you can master it, right? And then on the other side, the identification of the raced body, of the black body, as natural and therefore savage and primitive, right? And sound fits into this too, and it becomes very tricky. You see Fred try to negotiate this space, talking about the importance of music and sound in terms of African American history, post-slavery, and during slavery, as well as Hortense Spillers. But then it's a line that for example, that Fanon kind of crosses a little bit too strongly and says, or I mean, it's part of his critique of negritude, for example, Fanon's critique of negritude. This idea of like the identification of blackness as this kind of pure musicality that one sees in Black Skin, White Mask. So that's kind of my association. Is what I'm trying to think of. And if one wants to preserve a kind of purity of sound on a cultural sense, like that there's a for some time now, there have been many courses. There were courses at Pratt, for example, on global music. Right? If one wants to preserve some idea of a kind of cultural purity of music that's not touched by the West, that's another form of essentialism. That's another form of kind of Orientalism, right? The creation of an outside to maintain the inside that would be again now the global North. But yeah, I hope that addresses what you're asking about. Yeah.
It does. I mean, it just it stimulates kind of further thought about it, because I guess in this particular context, as people are in the process of producing different forms, it also raises, it makes me curious about ways of you're addressing the discourse around it. And so in terms of the production of it, what kind of distinction might be made, as well as thinking about, I thought it was very interesting what was raised about elite aesthetic forms. And I agree with you, Michael. I mean, in terms of the notion that, I think that that's related very much to the language that circulates in ways that has power differently than something that might be imagined within the discourse to be popular. And I mean, this is something I'm describing as I'm thinking it, so I haven't worked it out. But I do think that there's something around like what's actually possible. Is there some in terms of like a breach of this this condition or the situation that's being described? Because that's the question that people in the position of producing always face.
Yes. I'm just writing down that you agree with me.
Okay.
Well, it's being recorded, so I don't need to write it
Yeah,
down.
I do agree with you, and
Yeah.
I think it opens up different things. I was thinking it was funny that I was thinking about the novel by Tayeb Salih, Season of Migration to the North, actually, in relation to thinking about elite aesthetics and certain kind of responses that can come to that have to do with a kind of dissection. And it seemed to me that in the way that you are circulating through these arguments, there's some kind of a relationship to that. But I'm intrigued by your way of encountering how you choose to look at the things that have to do with looking at forms, the meta. I guess.
Could you say that last part? I'm usually good at the meta, but you lost me there. So just repeat that last part again.
No, I think what I'm experiencing in listening to you is your exploration in looking at things that are being looked at or described within a particular discourse, and so they're being embraced almost as if they're the notion of the affect and the power of sound, for example, that it's meant to almost be a substitute for feeling, for some form of actually experiencing something, and it's very uncertain what is this space of whatever it is that takes place.
Right. Well, I mean, personally, I'm attracted in terms of the meta critique. I'm attracted to the reinscription of for me very familiar kinds of metaphysical concepts. So that's what I'm trying to trace out in my work and kind of like map out, document, and say can't we do better? So. I mean, what's wrong with metaphysics? Well, this is something that sometimes we forget, those of us who are interested in critiquing metaphysics. So what metaphysics does is try to provide a kind of ground to understand something that that does not change, right? And it's a kind of essentialism. It is a belief in a kind of essence that is always present, right? That you can just evoke or touch on. So, and that's what I was trying to talk about in the discourse about encountering sound, right? It's preformed. We don't have to interrogate. We don't have to ask what is sound art in the real sense. Like, we're not just holding a symposium, right? Because what is sound art becomes a reason to hold a symposium rather than a real investigation, because everyone ends up saying the same thing at the end, right? Or anything else. I'm trying to think of the equivalent of philosophy, because I can make fun of philosophy as much as anything else too. But it's almost so sad that it's not worth making fun of. But I mean, I guess in terms of what is actually possible, I think that this is where I'm interested. I am definitely interested in what Rancière does. Is like you see this taking place in Rancière's discourse, that he wants to keep open the possibility of something possible, of actually something new, and Badiou is doing the same thing, right? Differently, but he's doing the same thing. But what Rancière sees are these police discourses that reinscribe the distinction between elite and non-elite, or self and other, and so on. In some ways, I think anything is possible. I mean, you do whatever, this is America, you do it, right? But against very material conditions, right? In some ways, I think that anything is possible, but I don't think anything is possible finally. And that's the kind of maddening aspect here. And that's what I'm interested in, is trying to keep stirring it up and showing how that, we can't keep talking. I mean, obviously we can, but it's not, I don't think it's productive. I don't think it's progress to keep talking about things as if they were self-evident, right? So I guess that's my question. That's my mode. I'm not sure. I'm still not sure I'm getting at what you're asking, but
you are
yeah.
into that. So then the semiocapitalism that you refer to is part of that, the stirring aspect of the
Yes.
Unsettled.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm trying to bring it, put these two against each other to kind of stir up Rancière, who's interested in stirring things up. So that's and maybe that was clear enough. There wasn't a lot of time to do it well. Yeah. But because then I would have to read Heidegger, and then everyone would have revolted and throwing chairs and stuff, and it would have been awful. So.
Knowledge production, and I think that, I may be too much of an Orientalist or something, but production, knowledge can be production. What about this, the processes of the empirical processes, that can't be put into the packages. But somehow, like I'm sorry to say, you guys, but what I mean, in order to come to some kind of conclusion or some kind of proof, you have to accelerate, idea further and further, and then it's coming down to the point of this knowledge production, and seems to be. That is, disturbing all power of each human being or artist who want to venture into their own adventure of to know what is this reality. Maybe it's called unreality. Immaterial is real to many of us.
Right.
So I don't know whether you guys exercising this, exercising to develop into the theory, or breaking up to the theory. Whether that is very productive, because the point of I think that we as a Homo sapien, we have given some certain sentiency, the system of biological, physiological system that we are given in our mind, in our head, in our brain. And the artist could go into it and venture into it and look inside of what we are, what power we have. And so, coming out of various names of that knowledge production, that seems to be, I don't know whether it is very, very helpful in a way, because this, as you mentioned, that there are so many exhibition about the sound, equaling, the understanding of sound in the material, But it's what kind of sound, It's the content of sound that we care. What is it in it, So it's like all the big exhibitions all world over,
Yeah.
But these things, it's a reactive, such a reaction to the reaction to the need of the, the system, that whatever the system, capitalistic system perhaps, made, and sneaks into this, art field in a way, so that we just have, as you know, that the culture in any culture, in any continent, in any nation, well, it was developed in such a long, it's such a huge amount of time and space, and came to the culture. But now we are dealing with, it's such a moment. It is not fair.
Let me try to respond briefly because I think there's a lot of things that you brought up, but I can't really speak to what you were talking about in terms of artists and being able to access or desiring to access this kind of our sentience. I think not everyone's got sentience, unfortunately, but I guess I'm interested in the way that institutions, if we could talk about this way, like we can think about institutions which includes disciplines, specific disciplines, but specifically educational institutions and such. They have there's a discourse of what one might say a kind of presentation of the real or investigation into the real, but it's not really real. It's a construction, right? And the subjects that are produced within these institutions they're produced to reproduce the simulacrum, not to really engage in I would say real questioning, because real questioning would bring down the institution. That's what I would say, just in response. But we could talk more because that you brought up a lot. Was that the?
Now it's a banking system is collapsing, and maybe this the economic system in the global system at this moment is in a verge of kind of dispersing. It's now we are facing in a time that all systems that so far developed in the last century or so. Maybe it's coming into the dispersion, so that perhaps from there too, if that the art can be serialized or stuff like that. It's maybe now we are into the place. It's that we have to go kind of beyond it, forget about the systematizing or whatever, composing or whatever.
You say compost?
Systems. Yeah. Let's go beyond this system that we have developed in a century.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, but I think, Renee, did you have something that you want to ask again? Close up.
No, I think that all the comments are very interesting, but I wanted to maybe at this time invite further discussion outside and also suggest that if anybody is interested to join us at the Cambridge Brewery, which we're going to go to afterwards. And I'd like to very much thank Michael for coming and engaging with us here. And I thank all of you for coming to the last talk of this season, but there will be more in the next. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.